To cut it off. Good Shabbos. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday? Yehud in South Carolina, Karen in Northern California, Shandor in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Renee saying Shabbat Shalom, Sharon in New Jersey, Marjorie in Georgia, Lanit in Silver Spring, and Spencer in Connecticut, Tom in PA, Lorraine in Texas, Gordo in Scotland. Fantastic. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be with you. Got a nice daf, practical, interesting. We love those. Where are we? We are on our daf. Today's page 83 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 5. Today continuing our discussion of Mishna number 6, which we will, God willing, complete and open Mishna number 7. Rabbi Yehuda said, there was an incident in the city of Tzalmon, where one individual planted his vineyard 16 by 16 cubits. Now, that doesn't mean a square 16 by 16 cubits. What that means is that it was a vineyard where the vines were more than 16 cubits apart. The rows of vines were 16 cubits apart. Now, so what's 16 cubits? That's each cubit is about 1.5 feet. So that's 24 feet. 24 feet is like 8 yards, 8 full paces. And that's actually considered farther apart than normal, right? Farther apart than normal. And because the rows are planted so far apart, they're actually not considered a vineyard. Rather, each row is considered one row of vines. Odd, but this is how it works. So even though you have a bunch of rows, because they're planted farther apart than standard, so they're just considered individual rows of vines and not a vineyard. And why does that matter? Because therefore the space between the rows doesn't become a prohibited area where you cannot grow other kinds, vegetables or grain, because we have a Torah prohibition, kilayim, that says you can't plant diverse kinds together. This is a chuk right? And the kind of law that is super rational. There's no common sense reason for this. It's just one of those rules that God said, don't do this, and we do it because, or we don't do it because God said so, right? So like same idea, the classic hook is the red heifer, the law of the red heifer. Why do the ashes of a red heifer purify one from corpse tuma? Why does the one who prepares the ashes that purify others himself become impure when he prepares them? We don't know, just because the Torah said so. And likewise, why can't we attach a donkey and an ox together to pull a wagon? Because God said so. So here, one of those rules, right? You can't plant diverse kinds in a vineyard. The Torah specifically mentions a vineyard. But if the rows are planted far enough apart, so it's not a vineyard. And think about it if you take it to a sort of extreme to help understand it. Let's say you had one row of vines, and then you have another row of vines, and the two rows are 100 yards apart. So obviously, they're not a vineyard. You can't say that the 100 yards between those two rows is all part of a vineyard, and I can't grow wheat or a vegetable patch there. So there, it's obvious. Now you bring those two rows closer and closer together. So when they're less than, depending on what that measure is, some say 16 cubits, some say 8 cubits. But once you're close enough together, then they start to define a vineyard, and you can't plant other things in between. But at 16 cubits, they're far enough apart that you can plant something in between, at least according to some opinions. So let's keep reading again. Rabbi Yehuda said there was an incident in the city of Salmon where one individual planted his vineyard 16 by 16. And what would he do? He would turn the branches of two rows that were facing each other to one side so that there was a full 16 cubits. The vines were 16 cubits apart, but once they become bushy, right, so then there's less than 16 cubits between the growths on the vines. But he trained the growths on the vine so that they all grew away from that 16 cubit area. So it was a complete 16 cubits that was available, and therefore he could plant there. He's still going to have to keep his grain products or his vegetables a certain distance away from the vine itself, but that's only going to be, I think, a cubit or 4 handbreadths. We're going to talk about that more. So he can't plant it right up against the vine, but he can use that 16 cubit area between the rows because it's a full 16 cubits. So he would turn the branches out away from that 16 cubit area, the branches of the vines, and then he would sow the clearing, right? He would plant vegetables or grain there. The following year, he would turn the branches to the place that was sown the year before, and he would sow the land that had been left uncultivated the previous year. In other words, he would open that 16 cubit area in alternate spaces between the rows from year to year. And this incident came before the sages, and they permitted it. This demonstrates that 16 cubits between plants is required for them to be considered separate units. Separate. If they're 16 cubits apart, they're not defining a vineyard, they're just separate rows. Why are we talking about this? Because our Mishna was all about when trees are sold, right? If you sell 2 trees in somebody else's field, so then the buyer acquires 2 trees. But if you sell 3 trees, as we'll see in a triangular arrangement, then the buyer acquires the 3 trees and the land between the 3 trees. And how far out does that triangle of land go? It's going to have, enough space around the outside of the trees that you can work the trees. Like somebody who's harvesting figs with his basket, he can work around the trees and get at them. So you're going to get that much space around that triangle of trees. And how much space is that? Well, we're still talking about that. That seemed to be either the fruit picker or possibly an ox with its vessels. Now, what if the 3 trees are 100 yards apart? Right, there's a tree over there, 100 yards that way. There's another tree, 100 yards that way. There's another tree, and you bought 3 trees. Do you get this massive triangle of land? That 100 yards, that's big, right? So that's like acres of land. Of course not. So the trees have to be close together. How close together? Less than 16 cubits apart, so that they're considered a unit, right? And that's why we're borrowing from this law of kilayim in the vineyard to understand when plants that are near each other are considered a unit and when they're not. It seems like if they're within 16 cubits of each other, they can be considered a unit. Rav Yosef said to him, I do not know about this incident in Salmon, but there was a similar incident involving the sale of trees in a village of shepherds. And they came before Rav Yehuda, and he said to the seller, and now we're on page 83a, go and give to, we started on the bottom of 82b, but now we're on 83a. So they came before Rav Yehuda, and he said to the seller, right? So somebody sold trees. It happens to be a village of shepherds, but the point is that somebody sold trees in a field. And so Rav Yehuda said to the seller, go and give to the one who bought the trees sufficient land for an ox and its vessels. But I did not know how much was sufficient land for an ox and its vessels. Right, so we're talking about how much land do you need around the trees so that you can work the trees, right? You can harvest from the trees. Earlier we said enough for somebody picking figs and his basket. Now we're getting a different measure, enough for an ox and its vessels to pass by the base of the tree. All right, and says Rav Yosef, I did not know how much was sufficient land for an ox and its vessels. So when I heard that which we learned in a Mishna on page 26a, I came to a conclusion with regard to this case. And that Mishna teaches as follows: a person may not plant a tree close by the field of another unless he places it at a distance of 4 cubits from the other field, right? So 4 cubits is about 6 feet. And he's saying you can't plant a tree within 6 feet of the property line of another person. Why? So he can work his field and you can work your field, right? So you can, the ox with its vessels has to be able to pass by, and that's about 4 cubits of width. Kind of makes sense. An ox with what's on it, about 6 feet wide. And so that's what he's saying. When you sell these 3 trees, you're going to need a 4 cubit distance around the outside. So Rav Yosef continues, and it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to this Mishnah, the 4 cubits that the sages stated are for the work of the vineyard, so that he does not take oxen and plow into his neighbor's field while tending to his own vineyard. And I studied this Mishnah and Baraisa, and I said, learn from it that the phrase sufficient for the ox and its vessels means 4 cubits. At this stage, the Gemara has demonstrated that Rav Nachman's opinion is supported by a Mishnah, whereas Rav Yosef's ruling is supported by the incident involving Rav Yehuda. What are we talking about? What ruling? That was at the end of yesterday's class, where we were saying what distance do those 3 trees have to be from each other so that they're considered a unit where you sell the 3 trees and you get the land between them. And so one ruling was Rav Yosef, in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, that the distance between the trees must be a minimum of 4 cubits and a maximum of 8 cubits, right? Interesting, if they're closer together than 4 cubits, this isn't going to count to sell the land because they're so pressed up against each other. We might expect that one of these trees will die. They're too close together, so that's why there's a minimum distance. But the maximum is 8, right? 8 cubits far apart. But then there's a second ruling which said that Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman, in the name of Shmuel. Now, both of these rulings are in the name of Shmuel. So one tradition was Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, and he says that Shmuel said 4 to 8 cubits. But the different tradition is Rava in the name of Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, who says that it's from 8 to 16 cubits, right? That the trees have to be no closer than 8 cubits and no further apart than 16 cubits from each other. So that's the ruling that we've been exploring here and borrowing, looking at other related laws to see which is right. Is it 4 to 8 or is it 8 to 16? So now going back to this. Rav Yosef continues, and it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the Mishnah, the 4 cubits that the sages stated. I'm sorry. And so far, at this stage, the Gemara has demonstrated that Rav Nachman's opinion, Rav Nachman was the one who said 8 to 16. He claims that Shmuel originally said 8 to 16. At this stage, the Gemara has demonstrated that Rav Nachman's opinion, 8 to 16, is supported by a Mishnah, whereas Rav Yosef's ruling that the distance between the trees should be between 4 and 8 cubits, this is supported by the incident involving Rav Yehuda. So the Gemara asks, but didn't we also learn a ruling in a Mishnah, Tractate Kilayim 4:9, in accordance with the opinion of Rav Yosef, right? So Rav Yosef is 4 to 8. So where was support for that? Well, that Mishnah in Tractate Kilayim teaches Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon say, in a case of one who plants his vineyard 8 cubits by 8 cubits, meaning the rows are 8 cubits apart, he leaves so it is permitted for him to bring seeds to the empty spaces between the rows. And this ruling can be cited in support of Rav Yosef. In other words, if you can plant other seeds when the rows of vines are 8 cubits apart, this would indicate that they don't form a vineyard, that 8 cubit distance is far enough apart that they're considered individual rows rather than an array of rows inside a vineyard. Otherwise, you couldn't plant other kinds of seeds in that vineyard. So that would be support for the ruling that says 8 cubits is the distance that if you have that or more, these plants are separate units and not combined to form something together like a vineyard or like a sale of 3 trees along with the land. And the Gemara answers, even so, it is preferable to cite the incident in Salmon as a proof. An incident sounds better than a legal ruling without an incident. Why? Whenever possible, it is preferable to provide support for an opinion by means of a practical ruling, because this demonstrates that the sages took action in accordance with that opinion and did not merely teach it as a halacha, as a Torah law in theory. So the Gemara comments, granted, according to the analysis of Rabbi Yosef, stated in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, we hear about the maximum distance that the trees can be scattered, and we hear about the minimum distance that they can be planted close together. The distance that the trees can be scattered is that which we said, 8 cubits, according to the first opinion, Rabbi Yosef in the name of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Is that which we said, and the minimum distance that they can be planted close together is, as we learned in a Mishnah, Tractate Kilayim 5:2, a vineyard that is planted in consecutive rows with less than 4 cubits between the rows is not classified as a vineyard because the rows are planted too close together. And this is the statement of Rabbi Shimon, and the rabbis say it is considered a vineyard. And one views the middle vines as if they are not there because they are slated to be uprooted. They're too close together. The vines are going to interfere with each other. You're not going to get a good growth of grapes. Whether you're growing the grapes for wine or for table grapes, whatever. If they're too close together, this is going to be harmful to the rows, and eventually that middle row is going to die or need to be removed. Since it needs to be removed, it already stands to be removed, and therefore there will be a correct distance between the rows, and that's why the majority say it is a vineyard. But according to the analysis of Rav Nachman, who said that the distance among the trees for them to consider a unit is between 8 and 16 cubits, according to the analysis of Rav Nachman, stated in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, we hear the maximum distance that the trees can be scattered is 16 cubits, as in that incident in Salmon. So concerning the minimum distance that they can be planted close together, did we hear this distance? And the Gemara answers, this is based on logical reasoning from the fact that, according to Rabbi Shimon, the minimum distance is half the maximum distance. So according to the rabbis as well, the minimum distance is half the maximum. So if that maximum is 16 cubits, the minimum is going to be half of that, or 8 cubits. Rava says the law, the halacha, is that one who buys 3 trees acquires the land if the distance between the trees is anywhere from 4 cubits to 16 cubits. This ruling is a combination of the two opinions, which is favorable to the buyer, right? So because he's going to get the land along with the trees, as long as the trees are more than 4 cubits apart and less than 16 cubits apart. So it's an expansive definition. You get the smallest minimum and the greatest maximum from the two opinions, and therefore the buyer is going to get the land along with the trees as long as we're within those parameters. And it is taught in a baraisa in accordance with this opinion of Rava. How close may they be? 4 cubits. And how far apart may they be? 16 cubits. Now, if one bought 3 trees that are planted in this manner, this one has acquired the land and the small trees that are between them. Therefore, if the tree dried up or was cut down, he has ownership of the land. If the distance between the trees was less than this or more than this, if he bought the trees one after the other, the buyer had, or if he bought the trees one after the other, this buyer has not acquired the land or the trees that are between them. Therefore, if the tree dried up or was cut down, he has no ownership of the land. Right? So this answers a question that came in at the end of class yesterday. I forget who asked it. But if you bought 2 trees, let's say that they were, within these parameters, so they were 10 cubits apart, right? So that's less than the 16. But if you only buy 2 trees, what have you bought? You bought the 2 trees and you get access to them, but you haven't bought the land between them. If you bought 3 trees that are all within a triangle and the legs of the triangle are, let's say, 10 cubits each, so then you got the 3 trees and you got the land between them. What if you bought 2 trees on Monday and on Thursday you bought the 3rd tree? So you ended up with the triangle of trees, but you didn't buy them all together. Did you then get the land with it on Thursday when you bought the 3rd tree? No. You have to buy them all together as a unit, or you simply bought 2 trees and you own those 2 trees, and then later you bought a single tree. Now you own the 3 trees as the buyer, but you didn't get the land between them because you didn't buy them all as a unit. And if you did get the land, then what's important about that is if one of the trees dies, you can replant the tree because that's your land. If you only bought the trees and one of the trees dies, you can't replant another tree there. New subject. Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma when one measures the distance between the trees. Does he measure from the narrow place on the trunk? When one measures the distance between the trees, does he measure from the narrow place on the trunk of the tree, or does he measure from the wide place? Rav Geviha of Bei Katil said to Rav Ashi, "Come and hear a proof." As we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Kilayim 7:1, when one comes to measure from the layered branch of the vine, he measures only from the 2nd root, as this is the average and not the widest part of the vine. So you can imagine that when you're talking about these trees, right, like if you think about a tree, the trunk is somewhat consistent thickness, but at the very bottom it comes out like this, right? So let's say that at the widest point of the trunk before it goes into the soil, you measure from there to the widest part of the next trunk, and it comes out to be exactly 16 cubits. So this is a problem for the buyer. Because if you measure from the average part of the trunk, they're going to be more than 16 cubits apart. And now what you've got is you're buying individual trees. You're not getting a unit that's going to come along with the land. Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. If the owner of the field sold to someone 3 branches that grew from one tree, and its trunk was covered with earth so that the branches appeared to be 3 separate trees, then what is the law? Are they considered 3 trees, which would mean that their owner acquires the ground between them? And Rav Gevicha of Bei Katil said to Rav Ashi, "Come and hear a proof," as we learned in a Mishnah, Kilayim 7:2, with regard to one who layers the branches of 3 vines into the ground so that they take root while still attached to the base of the vine. Right? If you train a vine from a grapevine, right? So and now it's kind of growing up on the trellises, right? It's a nice long vine. And then you take the vine off the trellis and put it down on the ground, right? And kind of secure it to the ground, and then it bends back up to the trellis. Well, the part that touches the ground over time will extend roots into the ground. So this started as a branch away from the root of the main vine, but now that you've bent it down to the ground, it sets roots in the ground. So what have you got? Sounds like you've now got two vines, right? Because there's two rooting places, even though they're connected. So what have you got there? Are they two distinct vines or are they one vine? With regard to one who layers the branches of three vines into the ground so that they take root while still attached to the base of the vine, and their roots that rise above the ground are visible, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says if there is a distance between them of 4 cubits to 8 cubits, they combine to form one vineyard composed of 6 grapevines. Meaning where they touched down on the ground and sent roots into the ground, that's considered a new vine. And if not, they do not combine, meaning they're new vines, but if they're too far apart, then they're not combined because they're too far apart, but they are considered separate vines. So it can be inferred from this Mishnah that the different branches of a tree are considered separate entities when the trunk is covered by earth, provided that the required distance comes out to be what we need, between 4 and 16 cubits, in order to sell the trees as a unit and get the land with them for the buyer. Rav Papa raises a dilemma: if the owner of a field sold to someone 2 trees in his field and one situated on its border, then what is the law? And similarly, if one bought 2 trees in the field of one person and the third tree was in the field of another person, then what is the law? Do the trees combine to form one unit of 3 trees or not? And the Gemara states that this dilemma is teiku, unresolved. The dilemma shall stand. Right? So since if you bought, let's say, 2 trees on my land and 1 tree on my neighbor's land, and the distance was correct, they were less than 16 cubits apart, right? So you bought a triangle of trees, but you bought 2 from me and 1 from my neighbor. My instinct would have been, no, they don't combine because you're buying from 2 different people. But that's not the answer. The answer is unresolved. Right, so in that situation, you certainly can't expect that you got the triangle of land, but I can't be sure that you didn't get the triangle of land, so there would be an uncertainty. So depending on what ensued later and who bought litigation against who, no one would have a law to count on, so they would have to bring other factors as evidence. When you're doing a deal based on a law that was left unresolved, don't rely on the Mishna or the Gemara to define the terms of the sale for you. It becomes all the more important to make sure that the buyer and seller have agreed on exactly what was being sold. Just the trees or the tree with the land. If the land, exactly what were the parameters of the plot of land that was being sold. All these rules are only in effect because somebody made a simple oral agreement and didn't define what was being sold. I think I've said that every day for 2 weeks now, so I'm sure you get the message. 83b. Rav Ashi raises a dilemma. In the case of a pit that was situated between the trees, what is the law with regard to the possibility that it divides between the trees, and therefore the owner of the trees does not acquire the ground? And similarly, in the case of a stream of water, what is the law with regard to the possibility that it divides between the trees? You've got a triangle of trees that are less than 16 cubits apart, but in the triangle between them, you have a pit or you have a stream that passes through. Does that divide up the triangle so that you don't get the triangle of land and you're considered, 2 trees on one side of the pit or of the ditch and 1 tree on the other side, and therefore they're not considered a unit, or they are? That's the question being asked. Likewise, with regard to a public thoroughfare that divides between the trees, what is the law? And finally, in the case of a line of palm trees that divide between these 3 other kinds of trees, what is the law? And no answer was given to these problems. The dilemmas shall stand. Teiku. Hillel raises a dilemma before Rebbe. When Hillel raises a dilemma before Rebbe, we're not talking about the famous Hillel that had Talmudic debates and disputes with Shammai. Those were hundreds of years before Rebbe and this Rabbi Hillel, so this is a different Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Hillel raises a dilemma before Rebbe. if a cedar tree grew between the 3 trees that one bought, what is the law? And the Gemara asks, well, if it grew, then it emerged in his domain. He got the land along with his triangle of trees, and later a cedar tree grew there. Of course it's his cedar tree. It grew on his land. Rather, the dilemma is as follows. If, when one bought 3 trees, there was already a cedar tree standing between them, then what is the law? Is it considered a division between the 3 trees, or is it part of the plot that he acquired with the 3 trees? Rebbe said to Hillel, since he bought the trees, he has thereby acquired the cedar, and he acquired the land between them. And the Gemara asks, in what manner must the 3 trees be positioned for the buyer to acquire the ground between them? Rav says they may be planted in a straight line. And Shmuel says, no, they must be planted in the form of a tripod. That doesn't mean that they're leaning in sort of like the sticks of a teepee. It just means that they're arranged in a triangle. They're not in a straight line. They are a triangle. So the Gemara notes, according to the one who says that the trees may be positioned in a straight line, all the more so one acquires the ground when the trees are planted in the form of a tripod. But according to the one who says that they must be positioned in a tripod, the buyer acquires the ground only in this case. But if the trees were planted in a straight line, he does not acquire the ground. And what is the reason? It is because when the trees are planted in the form of a straight line, one can sow the land between them, and therefore the seller would not relinquish his right to the ground between the trees, and that is the halacha. You don't get the ground between the trees if the trees are planted in a straight line, only if they are arranged in a triangle. Rav Hamnuna objects to this, and according to the one who says that the trees must be planted in the form of a tripod, what is the reason that one who buys the trees acquires the ground? Is it that one cannot sow between the trees? But if that is so, in a case where one sold another 3 Roman thorny shrubs, where one cannot sow between them because the shrubs grow outward, horizontally and take up a lot of space, and so you can't sow the ground between them, so too would he say that the purchaser has ownership of the ground? And the other sage said to Rav Hamnuna, those Roman shrubs are not trees, and they are not considered significant, as they are merely shrubs, and therefore the ground is not acquired when one purchases them. By contrast, these, meaning the trees, are significant. Shrubs, if you purchase 3 shrubs, you don't get the ground between them. If you purchase 3 trees, you get the ground between them. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 5. Now, Mishnah number 7. And I'm pretty close to done for the day. So if you've got questions or comments, please get them in now. Okay. Mishnah number 7. One who sells the head of a large domesticated animal has not sold along with it the 4 legs, as each part is considered important in its own right. Who's buying and selling parts of live animals? I don't know at what point it's being sold, whether you can actually make this sale while the animal is alive, but what they're talking about is the meat, right? So whether the animal has been slaughtered already or not, what's being sold here is the right to receive the head and the 4 legs, once the animal is slaughtered, okay? One who sells the head of a large domesticated animal has not sold along with it the 4 legs, as each part is considered important in its own right. The head is significant, the 4 legs are significant. All the more so if one sold the 4 legs, he has not sold the head, right? In terms of a living animal, you could say that the head is more significant than the 4 legs. But if you're talking about an animal like an ox that's sold for its meat, yeah, so the 4 legs are more significant than the head because there's a lot more meat on the 4 legs than on the head. So all the more so if one sold the 4 legs, he has not sold the head. Similarly, if one sold the windpipe and the lungs, he has not sold the liver, despite the fact that they are sometimes attached to each other. And if he sold the liver, he has not sold the windpipe and the lungs. But in the case of small domesticated animals, if one sold the head, he has sold the 4 legs. Although if one sold the legs, he has not sold the head. And likewise, if one sold the windpipe and the lungs, he has sold the liver. But if he sold the liver, he has not sold the windpipe and lungs. And really, we're learning here kind of a little bit about market shopping in Talmudic times, what you could expect when you went by the butcher, what kind of were the minimum cuts and what sort of cuts were available. Now, there are 4 basic cases with regard to sellers and buyers. Now, we're not on the subject of meat anymore. We're just more generally on sellers and buyers. If the seller sold him wheat and he said that the wheat was good and it is found to be bad. So the buyer, right? The buyer was told, I'm selling you good wheat. And when the buyer received it, what did he receive? He received bad wheat. So the buyer did not get what he was bargaining for, not what he expected. And that is why the buyer can renege on the sale. If he agrees to take the bad wheat, even though he was offered good wheat, the seller cannot back out of the deal. By contrast, if the seller sold him wheat that he thought was bad, and it is found to be good, the seller can renege on the sale. Right? The seller said, he said, I'm selling you this wheat. It's not very good, and that's why it's cheaper. And then it turns out that it was good wheat. Now the seller can renege on the deal because he wasn't selling what he thought he was selling. The buyer, who would be getting a better deal than he expected, obviously he doesn't have the right to renege on the deal because he's getting what he bargained for. In fact, he's getting more than he bargained for. It's the seller who can pull out of this deal when they realize that what was being sold as bad wheat, in fact, was good wheat, more expensive. If he sold bad wheat and it is found to be bad, or good wheat and it is found to be good, then neither one of them can renege on the sale, as they both got what they bargained for. If the seller sold reddish brown wheat and it is found to be white, or white wheat and it is found to be reddish brown, and similarly if he sold olive wood and it is found to be wood of a sycamore, or he sold the wood of a sycamore and it is found to be the wood of an olive tree, or if the seller sold him wine and it is found to be vinegar, or he sold him vinegar and it is found to be wine. In all of these cases, the seller and the buyer have the right to renege on the sale. Why? Because the sale, what they bargained for, what they agreed to buy and sell, was a different item than that which was delivered. The transaction can therefore be nullified even if there was no mistake with regard to the price. Even if the price paid in the end was fair for the object that changed hands, that's not the object that they had negotiated for purchase and sale. So even if it has the same value, still both parties have the right to pull out of the deal when it is revealed that that which was being bought or that which was being sold was not what they thought. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Rav Chisda says that the seller sold him an item that was worth 5 dinars for 6 dinars. And the item became more expensive and its value stood at 8 dinars. And the seller wished to return the money and cancel the sale because the item's value had increased. Who is exploited here? The buyer. And therefore the buyer, but not the seller, can renege on the sale despite the fact that in such a situation the seller loses out. Let's review. I have an item that is worth 5 dinars, right? So I'm gonna sell you these fancy scissors, right? And let's say that I'm saying these scissors are worth, I say to you, these scissors are worth $6. I will sell them to you for $6. And you agree. But in fact, it turns out that the market value of these scissors in this condition is $5. The difference is great enough that you can say, hey, I thought I was getting $6 scissors. Sal, you're selling me $5 scissors for $6. Probably I got them for $2 or $3, right? I'm claiming that they're worth $6, but really they're worth $5. And now you can prove that because you see it on sale another place. You could say, you know what, Sal, I don't want this deal. I know I agreed to it. We shook hands on it. I'm out because you are overcharging me. You can walk away. What if I have these $5 scissors? I'm selling them to you for $6. You agree to take it. You give me the $6. And then I find out that actually the price of these scissors, which had been, the real value was $5, I'm charging you $6. But in the meantime, there was a shortage of scissors, and now it turns out these scissors are worth $8. So I say to you, hey, I don't want to do this deal anymore, sorry. You could say to me, whoa, whoa, whoa. When you started to make, when we agreed on this sale, turns out that you were charging me 6, they really were only worth 5. So you have a right to pull out of this deal. I don't, right? Even if later the price stands at $8, that condition didn't exist at the time of our deal. At the time of the deal, they were worth 5. I'm charging you 6. You have a right to pull out. I don't. So even though later they were worth $8, and that would be my motivation for trying to pull out of the deal, I don't have a right to pull out of the deal. Only you do. And this is because the buyer can say to the seller, if you had not exploited me, you would not be able to renege on the sale, and I would receive the profit. Now that you have exploited me, can you renege on the sale and benefit? And similarly, the Tana of the Mishna also taught, if the seller sold him wheat while claiming that the wheat was good, and it is found to be bad, the buyer can renege on the sale. And this implies that the buyer can renege, but not the seller. Even in a situation where the seller would want to renege on the sale, for example, if the item later became more expensive. That's where we'll leave off. We're at the top of page 84a. And God willing, we'll be together again tomorrow, Saturday night, after Shabbos ends in LA. It's getting earlier and earlier, but I think last week I got on the air about 9, so that's, good target for this week. Maybe a little before 9 would be great. Okay, some questions. What if it's an extremely acute triangle, says Tom Beck? Well, if it's an extremely acute triangle, then you're going to have a situation where the two trees that form the short base of your acute triangle are probably going to be too close together, right? They're going to be less than the minimum 4 cubits apart. If they're not, then the triangle is not so acute. You have the minimum distance on all 3 legs, and the triangle works. If one leg is too short, it's less than 4 cubits, so then you don't have that minimum distance, and you don't get the triangle of land. It would just be 3 individual trees, is how I read it. Sharon, sounds like there was a form of lemon law in Talmudic times. Just so, right? And we've seen it before. It's 1/6, right? If the deal was, well, that's in terms of the value of what we talked about exploitive. But this idea, I'm sorry, those are separate issues about the 1/6. Let's put that aside for a second. But yeah, this idea that if I'm offering you good and you agree to buy it and it turns out that it's bad, so then you can walk away, is a lemon law. Absolutely right, Sharon. And what's so interesting is because I was selling a lemon and claiming it was an orange, right? I can't get out of the deal if you decide you want to go through with it, but you can. And finally, Renee, it's the duct tape driving the price of the scissors down. Right. But it's specialized duct tape and a repair made by, an artist. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Motzi Shabbos, to learn page 84. May you all have a sweet and rejuvenating and uplifting Shabbos, and may we go into it and come out of it hearing only good news. We say Amen. All the best.